Think about a child you know. Maybe they're on a screen right now. Maybe they're complaining about dinner. They woke up this morning with a safe roof over them, food waiting in the kitchen, and the quiet, unquestioned certainty that tomorrow will come. For almost all of human history, that certainty didn't exist. Not the safety, not the food, not the tomorrow. For 300,000 years, being born into this world meant entering a set of conditions so brutal that half the children who arrived never made it to the other side. No vaccines, no antibiotics, no hospitals, no protected period of innocence set carefully apart from the hard realities of staying alive. So, what was it actually like? And what does it mean that most of us have no idea? Let's start with the number half. Roughly half of all children born in the ancient world died before reaching puberty. Not in one unlucky era, not in one region, everywhere. Researchers Anthony Valk and Jeremy Atkinson spent years pulling together the historical and archaeological mortality estimates from hunter-gatherer societies, early agricultural communities, and ancient civilizations across the globe. The pattern was the same every time. At the Indian Knoll archaeological site in Kentucky, dating to around 2500 BCE, 30% of children died in their first year of life alone. More than half never reached adolescence. This wasn't misfortune. This was the baseline of human childhood for almost our entire existence as a species. But here's what most people get wrong when they imagine it. Those children were not fragile. They were not passive. And the communities surrounding them were not cold or indifferent to their fate. Something else was happening, something that only makes sense once you understand what ancient childhood was actually built to do. Here's what the evidence shows. By age 5 or 6, in most hunter-gatherer societies, a child was not preparing to contribute. They were already contributing, foraging for food, hauling water, managing fire. Anthropologist Barry Hewlett of Washington State University spent years studying the AK foragers of the Central African Republic and found that children as young as 6 or 7 had already learned to hunt, identify edible plants, and care for younger children. Not in theory, in practice, daily. That's not a childhood built around protection from the world. That is a childhood built around absorption of it. And then there was disease. This is where the numbers become genuinely hard to sit with. Research on modern hunter-gatherer populations, the closest living mirror we have of ancient life, shows that roughly 70% of all deaths were caused by infectious, parasitic, and zoonotic diseases, not predators, not violence, invisible enemies, gastrointestinal infections from contaminated water, respiratory illness moving silently through a group, parasitic loads accumulating in a small body from birth. Ancient DNA recovered from the teeth of 2 children who died in Siberia around 32,000 years ago revealed traces of adenovirus, the same pathogen family that causes respiratory infections today. It was already there in the bodies of children tens of thousands of years before anyone had a name for it. There was no treatment. There was no intervention. The body either mounted a defense or it didn't. The children who survived were not simply lucky, they were filtered. Every infection their immune system overcame built a biological resilience that a modern child raised in a sanitized and medicated environment simply doesn't have. Ancient survival was, in part, forged through contact with threats that would send a modern parent straight to the emergency room. But survival was only one requirement. The other was knowledge, and this is where it gets extraordinary. Across ancient societies, from prehistoric foraging bands to early agricultural communities, childhood was not a protected developmental window. It was a working apprenticeship with a hard deadline. By the time a child in a hunter-gatherer group reached adolescence, they were expected to arrive already knowing everything below the threshold of the most complex adult skills. Not introduced to it, fluent in it. Adults, according to research by anthropologist Shana Lou Levy and colleagues at Cambridge, only began directly teaching complex skills like large game hunting and advanced tool manufacture once a child had already reached adolescence. Before that, the expectation was that children had absorbed what they needed through watching, imitating, and doing. Some of you are thinking, but children have always played. That's true. And here's the important part. In these societies, play and learning were the same thing. Children in the Hadza and Baka communities formed multi-age groups where they built small-scale shelters, practiced foraging, and mimicked adult tools. Not as games, as preparation. The line between playing and training didn't exist. Now here's the part that tends to get left out entirely. Ancient communities knew what they were losing when a child died. At the Mesolithic site of Vedbek in Denmark, a newborn was buried on a carefully prepared wooden platform, surrounded by traces of red ochre. The grave had been left open, deliberately, so the child could be looked upon. That detail stops archaeologists. It wasn't just burial, It was a vigil. Someone or many people stood over that small body and looked at it, chose to look at it. At the Arma Verana cave in northwestern Italy, researchers uncovered the burial of an infant girl from around 10,000 years ago. She was interred with hundreds of carefully perforated shell ornaments and pendant beads, objects that required hours of skilled labor to make. Someone made those objects for a child who would never grow up to wear them. Archaeologists noted the find represented, in their words, significant material and emotional investment in the child's interment. Grief is not a modern invention. The evidence is buried in the ground and it's everywhere. The children who endured ancient childhood and came out the other side were not stunted by it. They were shaped by it into something that is difficult to fully comprehend from where we stand now. But by the age that a modern child is completing elementary school, an ancient child of the same age in a foraging society was making real decisions about their own foraging routes, reading environmental signs most modern adults couldn't identify, and carrying a working knowledge of the natural world that took years of daily accumulation to build. There was no graduation, no certificate, no ceremony marking the end of childhood as a protected phase. There was simply a point, usually marked by community ritual, by physical trial, by a collective act of recognition, when a young person was acknowledged as someone who had demonstrated they could survive, not because they had reached a particular age, because they had shown it. Now look back at the child you thought of at the beginning, the roof over them last night, the food they didn't think about this morning, the tomorrow they're not worried about. Every one of those things was paid for across hundreds of thousands of years by children who had none of them, who learned to read the landscape before they learned to read, who carried immunity built through suffering rather than medicine, who grew up fast because the world required it, and who died, half of them, before they ever had the chance to pass on everything they had learned. The childhood, extended, protected, deliberately set apart from the labor of surviving, is not the human default. It is the newest thing we have ever built, and we have had it at any real scale for less than 100 years. Before that, for almost every child who ever lived, the world began asking everything of them almost from the first day they arrived in it.